I remember biking loads as a kid. My dad loved cycling, he still loves cycling, and we'd bike all over the place in Metro Vancouver. But I never saw cycling as more than a recreational activity for getting around. Why? Because the spaces I lived in were not designed around cycling as a transportation mode. In fact, they often actively discouraged cycling, with things like no multi-use paths or bike lanes, and gates everywhere to prevent cyclists from actually being able to stay on their bike. Truth be told though, cycling and bikes are key to fixing so many of the problems with our cities, from congestion to emissions to public health. Bikes can give transit superpowers, so let's talk about it. The first thing I can say is I'm not a cyclist. The same way I can't blame people for not using transit when transit is bad, I don't really blame myself for not cycling when cycling in suburban Toronto is taking your life into your own hands. However, I do want to live somewhere in the future where cycling feels like a real option, so stay tuned for that. This video is also very explicitly about bikes and transit, not just about bikes. If you want videos just about bikes, or somewhat mainly about bikes, you should go check out Shifter or Not Just Bikes. I'll leave descriptions to their channels down below. So if I'm presenting bikes as a solution, what's the problem? Space. Our cities in North America are especially sprawly. The space between where we are and where we want to go is often way too large. But as it turns out, once you're on a bike, you can go surprisingly far, surprisingly quickly. Dedicated infrastructure makes the whole experience far, far better. Of course, from a transit perspective, having an area where people can actually cycle means that the area where you can capture passengers from is much, much larger. Let's look at an example. This is the area around Agincourt GO station in suburban Toronto. These are the areas where you can walk up, and these are the areas where you can cycle up in just 10 minutes. Of course, people won't ride bikes en masse if they don't feel safe, and if space isn't afforded to them. And that's probably the main reason you don't see hordes of people riding to suburban subway and GO stations in Toronto. People just don't feel safe. It's also important to remember that suburban train stations that are largely designed around car use forget some basic things about pedestrians and cyclists. For example, at Milliken GO, just one station north of Agincourt, you can see that when coming from the south side, you only have to detour around the block for about a minute in a car. But if you're walking or riding a bike, that's going to be a 10 to 15 minute detour where you have to go around the whole block. A simple pathway to the south of the station connecting to Passmore Avenue would massively shorten this travel time, but it doesn't even come into mind because most people arrive by car. Crosswalks are another big problem. Since our cycle times are so large in suburban areas in North America, each crosswalk can take a surprisingly long time to shift, which makes travel times not only longer, but also incredibly variable, which is bad because it means that, hey, if my train's coming in 15 minutes, I may have to leave now, or I might be able to get away with leaving in 5 minutes from now. The next issue, of course, is what you do when you get to the station, or perhaps how you get into the station. When you're rolling a bike, it can be a lot harder to go upstairs or open a door, and this is where great accessibility features are super useful. Having easy push buttons to open doors and large lifts to carry people are super useful not only for people with mobility needs, but for cyclists. It's a good time to remind you that accessibility improvements are a rising water that lifts all boats. You can also remember that more specialized options exist for cyclists, like bike gutters that let you roll your bike up the stairs. Even better, are stations designed so that cyclists don't need to ascend or descend any stairs with their bike. Once you're stopped at a station, parking your bike is really important. Notice how you'll often see bike racks in suburban North America at community centers or businesses that are often unused? Well, that's because people probably don't feel that their bike is secure, either from theft or more likely from the weather. People might be okay riding in the rain, but it really sucks to have to get onto a bike that's soaking wet for a ride. Especially if it's sunny and it had rained earlier and your bike is just still soaking wet. The ideal solution to this is a secure and weather-protected bike room somewhere in your station facility. Fortunately, these are actually growing increasingly common in North America. Better still is if this room can be a little bit off the beaten path. Basically what I'm saying is if you're just walking in from the street, maybe you shouldn't easily be able to see the bike room. You might have to go around a corner or something. The reason that's ideal is it provides a little more passive security. People don't usually mind walking 10 steps extra to get to their bike, but it's nice to know that your bike is really secure because people aren't just going to see your bike sitting there out front of the station. You'll notice in station focus videos, I always pay attention to what kind of bike parking options are available. It's often unfortunate in North America that we don't have a lot of options, but the SkyTrain in Vancouver is incredibly good. There's often really nice glass rooms, which of course provide additional security, as well as weather protection. They're large and clean and often feature some bike tools and a rack so you can do work on your bike like changing a tube or tightening something up. And better yet, the ones in Vancouver are locked with your fare card, so you don't have to remember a password or bring an additional key. Now, covered bike racks like you see at many GO stations are less than ideal, but as you go further and further out into the suburbs and into even rural areas, you need less and less security, and just a covered bike rack can actually be sufficient. Of course, it's also critically important to link your station up with local bike infrastructure. If there are plans to start building bike lanes, a transit station is a great place to start. This is something we're actually seeing at Milliken Station in Toronto. Multi-use pathway connections are also a big bonus. The more access people have from their bikes, the more likely it is that they'll use a bike to get to your station. Now you might think the journey is done when we get to the station, but that's not necessarily the case. Some people might want to take their bike with them onto the vehicle to do the last mile of their trip on their bike as well. There's really no excuse not to have bike racks on buses in the 21st century, but some trains don't provide space for bikes, especially on congested lines or at congested times. You should always remind passengers that folding bikes are available, and they should be allowed at any time, because folding bikes are a great option that often just go forgotten by many people. That said, some train systems do try to accommodate bikes, during much of the day even sometimes. Caltrain, for example, uses the lower level of a bi-level car on regular services to provide bike racks for this exact purpose, something I'd like to see on GO Transit if low ridership continues in the longer term. Other systems, including light rail and commuter rail systems I've seen in the United States, provide hanging bike racks inside of trains, which is a great option to store a few bikes per car. If your service frequency is high, you don't need to provide that much storage space per vehicle because you'll have a lot of vehicles per the number of cyclists you have. Now, when you get to your destination station, particularly in the core, bike considerations shouldn't stop. Secure bike rooms here are super useful as well. Some people are going to be living downtown and hopefully increasingly more and more, and so allowing those people to show up at the station via biking is a great option as well. Of course, bike rooms at destination stations are also great because some people can store bikes there overnight. And this could be a great way for someone who's maybe walking up to their origin station to then cycle from their destination station to whatever destination they're going to, maybe a workplace. There are also many considerations to talk about for cycling to workplaces, like providing storage there and providing showers and the like so that people feel comfortable cycling to work. It's something you're seeing in more new developments in Toronto, but it's something we need to see way more broadly. Of course, bike share is also an option from destination stations, but it's a little more inconsistent, and so people doing a regular commute probably don't want to use it. Suffice to say, bikes can make transit so much more powerful by expanding its reach and target audience. But even better, bikes are actually great at displacing local transit trips, like bus trips. Now, you know I love buses, but buses do have some problems. They're much less efficient than rail transport because you need a lot of operators per number of passengers you move. They're also more expensive to maintain and operate because of their fossil fuel nature, at least until electric and trolley buses become more and more popular in the future. But perhaps most of all, because a lot of trips are trips that people can just make on a bike or by walking. And if people do make those trips that they can by cycling or walking, that just frees up more capacity on the buses for a reduced but consistent service schedule, as well as more spaced out stops and faster service, so everyone wins. So that's my first of many videos on bikes in transit. What things do you appreciate when using your bike on transit, and what should I talk about in the next video? Leave a comment down below, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.